The cold was a living thing. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her cloak, a predator with teeth of ice that gnawed at her bones. Ilara pulled the fabric tighter, a futile gesture against the relentless wind that howled through the skeletal trees of the whisperwood. Each gust felt like a personal attack, a reminder from the world that she did not belong. Here, on the far-flung edge of the Blood Moon Pack's territory, belonging was a luxury she had never been afforded. Survival was the only currency, and she was nearly bankrupt. Her fingers, numb and stiff, fumbled with another brittle branch. She added it to the small bundle cradled in her arm, the wood barely enough to fight off the encroaching frost in her tiny, drafty hut for a few hours. It was a pathetic haul for a full afternoon's work, but her energy was as scarce as the dry wood. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, a familiar companion she had long since stopped trying to appease. Food was for the pack, for the strong. She was neither. She was Ilara, the outcast, the flaw, the moon goddess, in what her former alpha had called a cruel joke, had blessed her with the pure white fur of an albino wolf. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, a stark contrast to the rich ambers and golds of her packmates. Where they saw strength in dark, earthy pelts, they saw only weakness in her snowy coat. She was a ghost in a world of shadows, a mistake of nature, an omega, and worse, a rejected one. The memory was a shard of glass embedded in her heart, twisting with every beat. It had been a year, but it felt like yesterday. Alpha Marcus, her fated mate, had stood before the entire pack under the light of the full moon. The pull of the bond had been a fire in her veins, a song in her soul, a promise of completion. She had looked at him with all the hope a lifetime of loneliness could muster. He had looked back at her with nothing but disgust. I, Alpha Marcus of the Blood Moon Pack, reject you? Ilara, his voice had boomed, each word a physical blow. The moon goddess has erred. I will not be shackled to a weak, pale omega. Your flaw will not be my pack's curse. Then he had turned to Celine, a sleek, dark-furred beta, and claimed her as his chosen mate. The pack had roared its approval, their cheers drowning out the sound of Ilara's world shattering. The snap of the bond had been an agony beyond description, a spiritual tearing that had left her hollowed out, a walking wound. From that moment, she was less than nothing. She was moved to the farthest hut, given the worst scraps, and treated with a mixture of pity and contempt that was somehow worse than outright hatred. Now, the wind bit at her exposed cheeks, and she tasted the salt of a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Crying was a waste of warmth. She had to get back before the last of the light faded completely. She turned, her worn boots crunching in the thin layer of snow, and began the slow trudge home. The forest was eerily silent, the wind the only sound. It was a heavy, watchful silence that prickled the hairs on her neck. Rogues were known to hunt in these borderlands, preying on the weak and the isolated. She was both. A sound cut through the wind's cry. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of a winter-starved animal. It was a child's scream, sharp and terrified, followed by the guttural, menacing snarl of a large wolf. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to her hut, bar the flimsy door, and pray the trouble passed her by. She was no warrior. Her wolf was small, her spirit broken. What could she possibly do? But the scream came again, higher and more desperate this time. It pierced through the layers of her despair, striking something deep within her, something she thought had died on the night of her rejection. Compassion, a foolish, useless emotion for someone like her. Yet, Her feet were already moving, carrying her towards the sound. She dropped her precious firewood, the branches scattering in the snow like broken bones. Her own survival no longer mattered as much as the terror in that small voice. She burst through a thicket of barren thorns, ignoring the scratches they left on her skin. In a small clearing, she saw him, a little boy, no older than 5 or 6, with dark hair and wide, terrified silver eyes. He was backed against a massive oak tree, his small body trembling. Towering over him was a rogue wolf, a hulking beast with matted, greasy fur and crazed yellow eyes. Its lips were pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed fangs dripping with saliva. It was gaunt, starved, and driven by a madness that made it doubly dangerous. There was no time to think, no time to weigh the odds or consider the certainty of her own death. The rogue lunged, its massive jaws snapping at the boy. A raw, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed erupted from Alara's core. "No!" she screamed, the sound thin and reedy in the vast, cold forest. She threw herself forward, shifting mid-stride. The change was clumsy, born of panic rather than practice. Bones snapped and reformed, her threadbare clothes tearing away as her small white wolf form emerged. She was a fraction of the rogue's size, a flash of white against the gray twilight, but she landed squarely between the beast and the boy. She didn't snarl or roar. She stood her ground, a trembling but resolute shield of white fur. The rogue, startled by her sudden appearance, skidded to a halt. It stared at her, its crazed eyes blinking. It seemed confused by this tiny, pale wolf who dared to stand in its way. It could likely snap her neck with a single bite. For a fleeting second, Alara's fear was so absolute it threatened to paralyze her. Her wolf whimpered in the back of her mind, begging her to flee. But then she glanced behind her at the little boy, his silver eyes wide with a fragile, dawning hope. That look solidified her resolve into something as hard and unbreakable as diamond. She wouldn't run. She had been running her whole life, from the pitying stares, the whispered insults, the crushing weight of her own worthlessness. She had nothing left to lose, but this child had everything. If her miserable life could be spent to buy his, then it would finally have meaning. She lowered her head and let out a snarl that was surprisingly fierce, a sound torn from the very depths of her battered soul. The rogue seemed to take her defiance as a personal insult. It lowered its head and charged. Alara braced herself, planting her small paws in the snow. She met the charge not with strength, which she didn't have, but with agility. She dodged the initial snap of its jaws and darted under its belly, sinking her teeth into its hind leg. The rogue howled in pain and fury, shaking its leg violently to dislodge her. She held on for as long as she could before she was thrown against the trunk of the oak tree. The impact sent a starburst of pain through her ribs, and she gasped for air. The rogue turned on her, its eyes burning with murder. It lunged again, and this time she wasn't fast enough. Its teeth, long and sharp, sank deep into her shoulder. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that stole her breath and her strength. She felt the warmth of her own blood matting her white fur, staining it a brilliant, shocking crimson. The rogue shook her like a rag doll, her vision blurring at the edges. Through the haze of pain, she could see the little boy. He was no longer screaming. He was just watching, his small face a mask of horror. A surge of adrenaline, the last of her reserves, flooded her system. She would not die like this, not while he was still in danger. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she twisted in the rogue's grip and raked her claws across its sensitive nose. The beast yelped, its grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She wrenched herself free, tearing flesh as she did, and scrambled away. The rogue, now bleeding from its nose and leg, seemed to reconsider its meal. This small, white pest was more trouble than it was worth. With a final, frustrated snarl, it turned and limped away into the deepening shadows of the forest, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by Alara's ragged, painful breaths. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind an ocean of pain. Her shoulder was a mess of torn muscle and shattered bone. Black spots danced in her vision. She tried to stand, to check on the boy, but her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the snow, her white fur turning pink as her blood seeped into it. The little boy slowly crept out from behind the tree. He approached her cautiously, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. He reached out a small, trembling hand and gently touched her blood-matted fur. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Alara tried to respond, to offer some reassurance, but all that came out was a soft whimper. The cold was returning, more intense than before, seeping into her from the frozen ground and from the gaping wound in her shoulder. The world began to fade to gray. Her last conscious thought was of the boy's silver eyes, so full of a life she had managed, somehow, to protect. Then, the darkness took her completely. Warmth. That was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to chase the perpetual chill from her bones. It was a foreign sensation, one she hadn't truly felt in years. The second thing was the softness beneath her, not the lumpy straw mattress of her cot, but something impossibly plush and yielding. The air smelled of herbs and clean linen, not the damp, musty scent of her hut. Ilara's eyelids fluttered open. They felt heavy, as if weighted down. She wasn't in her hut. She was in a vast room, larger than any she had ever seen. The ceiling soared high above her, carved with intricate patterns of vines and wolves. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth the size of her entire hovel, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. She was lying in a massive bed, tucked under a thick fur blanket that felt like spun silk. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Where was she? Who had brought her here? Her last memory was of collapsing in the snow, of the little boy's face. The boy, was he safe? She tried to sit up, but a searing pain shot through her shoulder, and she fell back against the pillows with a gasp. She looked down and saw that her shoulder was heavily bandaged. The wound had been cleaned and dressed with a fragrant healing salve. The heavy wooden door to the room creaked open, and Alara's heart leaped into her throat. A tall, imposing figure stepped inside, and the very air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy with power and authority. He was flanked by two other men in silver and black uniforms, their faces stern and watchful, but it was the man in the center who commanded all of her attention. He was the most powerful man she had ever seen, tall and broad-shouldered. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of immense strength held in check. His hair was the color of midnight, and his jaw was strong and square, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten silver, almost identical to the little boy's, and they glowed with an inner light, radiating an aura of command that left no doubt as to his station. He was an alpha. Not just an alpha, but something more, something ancient and powerful. He stopped at the foot of her bed, his silver eyes surveying her with an unreadable expression. Fear, primal and instinctual, coiled in Ilara's stomach. She was a weak omega, an outcast, found on the edge of a territory. In the presence of such power, she was nothing. She instinctively tried to make herself smaller, to shrink into the mattress and disappear. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. It was not unkind, but it held an absolute authority that tolerated no argument. Alara could only manage a small, terrified nod. Her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere between her fear and her awe. The Alpha King took a step closer. "My son, Kale, told us what happened. He said a white wolf saved him from a rogue." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "He refused to leave your side. When my guards found you, he was curled up against you, trying to keep you warm. He said you were his guardian angel." Relief washed over Alara, so potent it almost made her dizzy. The boy, Kale, was safe, and he was this man's son. Her selfless act hadn't been in vain. That was all that mattered. The rest, her fate, her whereabouts, was secondary. Is he all right?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice raspy. A flicker of something surprise, admiration, crossed the Alpha's face. "He is perfectly fine, thanks to you." He gestured to one of his guards, who stepped forward. "This is Commander Valerius. He and his men were part of the search party. We were visiting the region when my son, in his infinite curiosity, wandered away from our encampment." The story began to piece itself together in her mind. This powerful Alpha and his son were visitors. The boy had gotten lost and stumbled into the path of a rogue, and she, by some twist of fate, had been there. "You were gravely injured," the Alpha continued, his silver eyes fixed on her bandaged shoulder. "My royal healers have tended to you. They say the rogue's teeth were coated in filth. Had you been left in the cold for another hour, the wound would have festered beyond repair. You would have died." "Royal healers?" The words barely registered. Her mind was still reeling from the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man before her. She didn't understand why he would go to such trouble for a nameless Omega. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why help me?" The Alpha's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You shielded my son with your own body. You sustained an injury meant for him. You gave everything you had to protect the future of my line, the heir to my throne. There is no debt I owe that is greater. I am Theron, Alpha King of the Northern Kingdoms. And you, little wolf, have earned my eternal gratitude, Alpha King." The title echoed in the silent room, in the silent chambers of her heart. This was not just some visiting Alpha. This was the king, the ruler of all packs, including her own, a figure of legend, a being of immense, almost mythical power, and she had saved his son. The world tilted on its axis, her small, miserable existence suddenly intersecting with the grand, sweeping narrative of kings and kingdoms. As he spoke his name, as his silver eyes met hers, something shifted. A spark, faint and deep, ignited within the hollowed-out space where her mate bond had once been. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was a thrum of energy, a hum of recognition that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. It felt familiar, impossible but familiar. King Theron felt it too. She saw it in the way his eyes widened, the way his powerful frame went rigid. A look of profound shock, followed by something else. A dawning, breathtaking wonder transformed his stern features. The air between them crackled with an energy that was visible, a shimmering current of silver and gold. "It cannot be," he breathed, his voice losing its regal command and becoming something far more personal, more vulnerable. He took another step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, then hesitating. Ilara's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confusion and fear, and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. What was happening? This feeling, it was like the faint echo of the bond she had shared with Marcus, but magnified 1,000 times. It was a tidal wave where the other had been a mere ripple. "Mate," Theron whispered, the word a reverent prayer. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of irrefutable fact, a truth the universe had just screamed into his soul. His silver eyes were no longer just looking at her. They were seeing her, seeing into the deepest parts of her, past the scars and the shame, and finding something worthy. The word hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head, the movement sending a fresh stab of pain through her shoulder. "No, you're mistaken. That's impossible." Her mind scrambled for an explanation, for any reason to deny the incredible, impossible truth humming between them. It was a mistake. A hallucination brought on by pain and blood loss. Or perhaps it was a cruel trick of the moon goddess, a second chance at a heart she no longer possessed to give. "I am a rejected Omega," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. She had to make him understand. She had to save him from this mistake before he too cast her aside. The humiliation would be more than she could survive. My own mate rejected me, publicly. The bond was broken. I'm broken. There's nothing left. She pulled the fur blanket tighter around herself, as if she could hide from his intense silver gaze. She felt the familiar shame wash over her, hot and suffocating. To be seen like this, to have her deepest wound exposed before this magnificent, powerful king, was a torment. But Theron did not look disgusted. He did not recoil. Instead, a look of profound, aching sadness crossed his face, followed by a wave of protective fury that seemed to make the very stones of the castle tremble. The fury was not directed at her, but at the fool who had hurt her. "Broken?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The alpha who rejected you was not just a fool. He was blind. He looked upon the moon and saw only a rock. The moon goddess does not make mistakes. She severed your tie to him because he was unworthy of you. She was saving you. For me," he closed the remaining distance between them, his large, warm hand gently covering hers where it clutched the blanket. A jolt of pure energy shot up her arm, a feeling of rightness, of coming home, that was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. "You feel it, do you not?" he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "This connection, it is the true bond, the one the goddess intended. It is stronger than any I have ever imagined." She couldn't deny it. The feeling was undeniable, a living presence in the room. But her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of worthlessness, fought against it. "But I'm weak. My wolf is small and white. They call me a curse. I am no queen." The last words were a choked whisper. Theron's gaze softened, but his voice was firm, imbued with the conviction of a king who had never known doubt. "Your wolf is not weak. She is pure. Her fur is the color of the moon itself, a sign of the goddess's highest favor, a mark only the ignorant would fail to recognize. And your heart, Ilara." He spoke her name for the first time, and it sounded like a song. "I have searched for my mate for over a century. I dreamed of a partner with a strong arm and a warrior's spirit. But the goddess, in her infinite wisdom, has given me something far greater." He leaned closer, his silver eyes holding hers, willing her to believe. She has given me a queen with a heart so strong, so compassionate, that she would sacrifice her own life to save a child she did not know. A queen who would face down a beast 10 times her size, not for glory but for kindness. That is not weakness. That is the truest, most profound strength I have ever witnessed. His words were a balm on her wounded soul. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever looked at her and seen strength. They had only ever seen the flawed exterior, the pale fur, the omega status. He saw something more. He saw her. He straightened up, his regal authority returning, but it was now tempered with a fierce, protective warmth directed entirely at her. He turned to his guards, who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence. "Commander Valerius," the king's voice boomed, leaving no room for question. "Send word to all the packs. The search for a queen is over. Inform them that I have found my mate. Her name is Elara. She is the savior of the royal heir and the future Luna Queen of the northern kingdoms." The commander's eyes widened, but he bowed his head low, his voice filled with renewed respect. "Yes, Your Majesty." He and the other guard bowed again, this time to Elara, a gesture so foreign and shocking that she flinched. Then they turned and exited the room, leaving her alone with the king. The declaration hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Luna Queen. The words seemed to belong to another language, another life. How could she, the forgotten Omega from the edge of the world, be destined for such a role? It felt like a dream, and she was terrified of waking up. The days that followed were a surreal blur. Elara was moved from the guest chambers to a magnificent suite of rooms adjoining the king's own. They were opulent beyond her wildest imaginings, with soft carpets, a private balcony overlooking the royal gardens, and a wardrobe filled with beautiful gowns of silk and velvet that had been tailored to fit her perfectly. It was all too much. She found herself retreating to the simplest dress, a plain gray wool, because it was the only thing that felt real. The palace staff treated her with a baffling reverence, bowing their heads and calling her Luna. Every time they did, she felt a jolt of panic, a desperate urge to tell them they had the wrong person. She was an imposter in this fairy tale, a stray dog that had wandered into a lion's den, and it was only a matter of time before they all realized the mistake. Her only comfort was Kale. The little prince, her savior in more ways than one, was her constant shadow. He seemed to sense her unease, and made it his personal mission to make her feel at home. He would bring her wildflowers he'd picked from the garden, his small hands clutching the stems tightly. He'd sit with her for hours, chattering about his toys and his lessons, his innocent presence, a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. He looked at her with pure, uncomplicated adoration, seeing not an Omega or a queen, but the white wolf who had saved him. Theron was a paragon of patience. He seemed to understand the depth of her trauma, the fear that held her captive. He did not push her. He did not demand she accept the bond or her new role. Instead, he simply made space for her in his life. He invited her to walk with him in the gardens, his large hand hovering near the small of her back, but never touching unless she initiated it. He ate his meals with her, not at the head of a grand table, but at a small, intimate one set up in her sitting room, asking her about her day and listening, truly listening, to her quiet, hesitant answers. One evening, he took her to the royal library. It was a cavernous room, with shelves stretching up 2 stories to a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. The air smelled of old paper and leather. He saw the awe on her face, and a gentle smile touched his lips. "I thought you might find some peace here," he said softly. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from a shelf. The title was embossed in silver, Legends of the Moon's Chosen. He opened it to a page with a beautiful, intricate illustration of a massive silver wolf standing beside a smaller, luminous white one. "Myths from the first packs," he explained, his voice a low murmur beside her. "They speak of the first Alpha King and his mate. He was a great warrior, forged in darkness and battle. But his mate, she was said to be a creature of moonlight, a white wolf, whose compassion was her greatest weapon. She healed the wounded, protected the young, and her wisdom tempered his strength. She was not revered in spite of her color, Alara. She was revered because of it. It was a sign of her purity, of her direct connection to the goddess." Alara traced the lines of the white wolf with a trembling finger. The story was beautiful, a fantasy. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with her. "It's just a story," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "All stories are born from a sliver of truth," Theron countered gently. He reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His silver eyes were filled with an unwavering belief that she couldn't comprehend. "What you did for Kale, that was not weakness. That was the heart of a queen, the heart of my queen, the pull of the queen." Bond was a constant, a warm current flowing beneath the surface of her fear. When he was near, the hollow ache in her chest eased. His presence felt like a shield, a promise of safety she had never known. But her past was a cruel ghost, whispering doubts into her ear every time she started to feel a glimmer of hope. "He says this now," the ghost would hiss in Marcus's voice, "but soon he will see you for what you are. A flawed, useless Omega. He will grow tired of you. He will cast you aside, just like before." She was terrified of that pain. The breaking of her first bond had nearly destroyed her. The breaking of this one, a bond 1,000 times more powerful, would be the end of her, and so she held back. She existed in a state of limbo, caught between a miserable past and a future too brilliant to believe. She couldn't accept the bond, but she couldn't deny its pull. She was healing, but she was still hesitating on the edge of a cliff, too afraid to fall and too tired to turn back. She knew she couldn't remain in this state forever. Theron was a king. He needed a queen, a true partner to stand by his side. He had been patient, but his patience couldn't last forever. A choice had to be made. But how could she choose to trust again when her own heart was a minefield of past hurts? How could she believe she was worthy of a king when she had spent her entire life being told she was worth nothing at all? The news arrived like a winter storm, sudden and unwelcome. The Northern Packs were due to arrive at the capital for the annual Oath of Fealty, a ceremony where each Alpha renewed their pledge of loyalty to the king. A list of the attending Alphas was delivered to the king's study, while Alara was sitting with him, sharing a quiet cup of tea. Theron scanned the parchment, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly as his eyes fell upon one name. "Is something wrong?" Alara asked softly, sensing the shift in his mood. He looked up, his silver eyes meeting hers. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Alpha Marcus of the Blood Moon Pack will be in attendance." The name was a physical blow. The teacup rattled in its saucer as her hand trembled. Marcus, here, in the palace where she had found a fragile, tentative safety. The ghost of her past was no longer a whisper in her mind. It was about to walk through the front gates. Her breath hitched, and the familiar, icy tendrils of fear snaked around her heart. "Alara." Theron's voice was firm, pulling her back from the edge of panic. He reached across the table and covered her trembling hand with his. "You do not have to see him. You do not have to attend the ceremony. I will make an excuse. No one will question it. Part of her wanted to accept his offer immediately. To hide in her rooms, to lock the door, and not emerge until Marcus and his pack were long gone. It was the easy choice, the safe choice. It was what the old Elara, the broken Omega, would have done without hesitation. But something had changed in her during her time at the palace. Theron's unwavering belief, Kale's unconditional love, they had planted a tiny, fragile seed of strength within her. To hide would be to admit that Marcus still had power over her. It would be confirming his assessment of her that she was weak, a creature to be hidden away in shame. She looked at Theron, at the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, and the tiny seed of strength began to sprout. She would not hide from her past, not in her new home. No, she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding a note of resolve that surprised even herself. I will be there. I will stand with you. A slow, proud smile spread across Theron's face. He squeezed her hand gently. As you wish, my queen. The day of the ceremony arrived under a steel-gray sky. Elara stood beside Theron on a raised dais in the great hall, looking down at the assembled alphas and their chosen representatives. The hall was a sea of power, a collection of the most dominant wolves in the northern kingdoms. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes filled with curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, outright disapproval. Whispers slithered through the crowd like snakes in the grass. An Omega? The Pale One? Is this the king's mate? She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. Her gown was a deep sapphire blue, a color Theron had chosen for her, saying it matched the hidden depths in her eyes. It was beautiful, but she felt like a child playing dress-up. Then she felt Theron's warmth as he subtly moved closer, his shoulder brushing against hers in a silent gesture of support. She drew strength from it, straightened her spine, and lifted her chin. Then she saw them. Standing near the front of the crowd were Alpha Marcus and his mate, Selene. Marcus looked just as she remembered, arrogant, handsome, his expression one of smug self-importance. Selene stood beside him, dripping with jewelry, her lips curved in a perpetual sneer. They hadn't seen her yet. Her heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The ceremony began. One by one, the alphas approached the dais, knelt before Theron, and renewed their oaths. Elara stood in silence, a statue carved from ice, her entire being focused on not letting her terror show. Finally, it was the Blood Moon Pack's turn. Marcus strode forward with a confident swagger. He knelt before Theron, but his eyes slid past the king and landed on Elara. For a moment, there was no recognition. He saw only a woman in a fine gown standing beside the king. Then, his eyes narrowed. A flicker of confusion, then dawning, horrified disbelief, washed over his face. His jaw went slack. Selene, following his gaze, let out an audible gasp. Her perfectly painted face twisted into a mask of ugly shock and envy. It was her, the worthless, pale Omega, standing where she, Selene, felt she rightfully belonged. Marcus recovered, quickly, his shock morphing into a sneering contempt. He clearly assumed she was some sort of servant or concubine, a pet the king had taken a temporary fancy to. He finished his oath to Theron, then rose to his feet. Instead of returning to his place, he took a step towards Elara. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Look what crawled out from the edge of the woods. I'm surprised the king allows strays to stand so close to the throne." A collective gasp went through the hall. Theron went utterly still, but Alara could feel the volcanic rage beginning to radiate from him. Celine, emboldened by Marcus's audacity, added her own venom. She should be back in her hovel, scrubbing floors. Those fine clothes are wasted on her. Alara felt the blood drain from her face, the public humiliation, the scorn. It was happening all over again. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. But before the despair could fully claim her, Marcus made his final, fatal mistake. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, possessive. "Whatever games you are playing, they are over," he snarled, his face close to hers. "You are Blood Moon property. You will come with me now." The world exploded. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A wave of pure, unadulterated power slammed through the great hall, so immense that it forced everyone, alphas included, to their knees. Dust rained from the rafters. The very stones of the castle seemed to groan under the pressure. The only two people left standing were Alara and Theron. Theron had not moved, but he was transformed. His silver eyes were blazing with a terrifying white-hot light. His aura, the invisible mantle of his authority as Alpha King, was fully unleashed, a crushing force of nature. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was a low, deadly rumble, colder and sharper than any shard of ice. "Release, my queen." Marcus froze, his hand still clamped on Alara's arm. He looked at Theron, his arrogant face suddenly pale with terror as the impossible truth finally crashed down upon him. This wasn't the king's pet. This was the king's mate, his queen. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. Your Majesty," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. I did not know. This is Alara. She was one of my Pax Omegas. A rejected—" "I know what she was," Theron interrupted, his voice dripping with lethal contempt. He took a step forward, and Marcus flinched back as if struck. "You stood before your pack and cast aside a gift from the goddess herself. You held a flawless diamond in your hand, and, in your blind, arrogant foolishness, you declared it to be glass and threw it in the dirt." Theron's gaze swept over the kneeling alphas. "Let this be a lesson to you all," he boomed, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "You see a white wolf and you whisper of curses and weakness. I see the color of moonlight, the mark of purity and courage. While this fool was shaming her, she was in my lands, shielding my son, your future king, from the teeth of a rogue. She faced a beast she could not possibly defeat, willing to trade her life for his without a moment's hesitation. And you?" His burning gaze snapped back to Marcus. "You call her weak?" He raised a hand, and Marcus was lifted from his feet by an invisible force, choking and gasping for air. Celine screamed. "You dared to lay your filthy hands on my mate," Theron growled, his fury a palpable thing. "You dared to insult her in my own hall. For that, your life is forfeit. Your pack is forfeit." "No, please!" Marcus rasped, clawing at his throat. It was then that Alara moved. She stepped forward and laid a gentle hand on Theron's arm. "Theron, stop," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the stunned silence. He turned to look at her, his eyes still blazing, but the inferno banked slightly at her touch. "He dishonored you, Alara. He must pay the price." "And he will," she said, her gaze shifting to the terrified, groveling Alpha. She looked at Marcus, at the man who had shattered her world, and she felt nothing, no fear, no hatred, only a distant, detached pity. He was small, insignificant. His opinion of her no longer mattered. His power over her was broken forever. His price will be to live with the knowledge of what he threw away. to return to his pack and tell them that the Omega he scorned is now his queen. That will be a greater punishment than death. Theron stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly nodded, a look of profound admiration dawning in his eyes. He lowered his hand, and Marcus dropped to the floor, gasping and sobbing. "You have heard the Queen's judgment," Theron announced to the hall. "Her mercy is the only thing that saves you today, Marcus. Now get out of my sight. Your pack's fealty is on probation. One more misstep, and I will wipe it from the face of this earth." Marcus and Celine scrambled to their feet and fled the hall, their shame and terror a palpable wake behind them. A slow, profound silence followed their departure. Then, Commander Valerius, who was kneeling near the dais, rose to one knee and bowed his head low, not to Theron, but to Alara. "My queen," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound absolute loyalty. One by one, all the other alphas and wolves in the hall followed his lead, rising to one knee and bowing their heads to her. The whispers of doubt were gone, replaced by a wave of respect and awe. They had not just witnessed the king's wrath, they had witnessed the queen's strength. A strength of mercy and wisdom that was, in its own way, even more powerful. Tears streamed down Alara's face, but for the first time in her life, they were not tears of sorrow or pain. They were tears of release, tears of vindication. The final wall around her heart, the one built from Marcus's rejection and a lifetime of shame, crumbled into dust. In its place, something new and strong and beautiful began to grow. She was not the broken Omega anymore. She was Alara, and she was a queen. Later that evening, after the ceremonies had concluded and the great hall was empty, Alara stood with Theron on the balcony of her chambers. The moon was high and full, casting a silvery glow over the sleeping kingdom. The air was crisp and cold, but she felt nothing but a profound warmth that radiated from her very core. She turned to face him, her blue eyes clear and steady. The last vestiges of her fear were gone, burned away in the crucible of the day's events. She saw him not just as a king, a powerful figure of authority, but as Theron, her mate, the one who had seen her when she couldn't even see herself. "What you said today," she began, her voice soft, "that the goddess saved me for you. I believe you were right." A look of immense relief and joy washed over his strong features. "Alara," he breathed her name, his voice thick with emotion. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "My whole life, I believed I was a mistake, flawed, unworthy of a mate, of a pack, of happiness. My rejection, it felt like confirmation of all those fears. But it wasn't an end. It was a detour. It was the path I had to walk to find my way here. To find you." She took a deep breath, letting go of the last shadow of her past. "The bond between us, I feel it. I have felt it from the beginning. I was just too afraid to accept it." She looked him directly in the eye, her heart open and vulnerable and stronger than it had ever been. "I am not afraid anymore. I choose you, Theron. I accept this bond. I accept you as my mate." The words were the most powerful magic in the world. Theron's silver eyes shone with unshed tears. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his powerful chest, holding her as if she were the most precious treasure in the universe. "And I choose you, Alara," he murmured into her hair. "I have been choosing you every moment since I first saw you. I will spend the rest of my life proving that my heart is a worthy home for yours." He drew back slightly, his hands cupping her face. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was the gentle click of the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. It was fire and lightning, yes, but it was also the quiet, steady warmth of a hearth fire on a cold night. It was the sealing of a promise, the joining of two souls who had been wandering the world, searching for their other half. In that moment, the bond between them solidified, a brilliant, unbreakable chain of silver light that wrapped around them both, tying them together for eternity. She was no longer a rejected Omega. He was no longer a lonely king. They were one. Their mating ceremony was held a month later, under the same full moon that had once witnessed her deepest shame. This time, however, it witnessed her greatest triumph. Every alpha from the northern kingdoms was in attendance, their heads bowed in respect. Alara stood beside Theron, not in borrowed finery, but in a gown of pure white silk that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, a perfect match for her wolf's fur. She was no longer hiding her nature, she was celebrating it. As the elder shaman bound their hands together with a silver cord, Theron leaned down and whispered in her ear, "My moon, my mate, my queen." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire being. "My home," she whispered back. Her life as queen was not what she had expected. She did not spend her days in idle luxury. With Theron's full support, she used her position to enact real change. She established sanctuaries for Omegas and other wolves who had been cast out or mistreated by their packs. She created new laws that protected the weak and ensured that no one would suffer the loneliness and despair that she had endured. Her compassion, once seen as a weakness, became the bedrock of her reign, earning her the love and fierce loyalty of her people. The tale of the White Wolf, queen who ruled with a gentle heart and an iron will, became a legend whispered in every corner of the kingdom. She never forgot where she came from. The memory of the cold, the hunger, and the hopelessness served as a constant reminder of her purpose. Her past was not a scar to be hidden, but a map that had led her to her true destiny. Standing on the balcony, with Kale playing at her feet and Theron's arm wrapped securely around her waist, she looked out at the kingdom she now helped protect. She had been rejected, broken, and thrown away. But in the end, by shielding the innocent, she had found a love that shielded her in return, and a home greater than any she could have ever dreamed of. She was finally, completely, whole.